We are truly blessed this morning to have Dr. Dale Manor speaking to us. His credentials are on the board. I'll let you read them to not take up his time. We've been blessed to have him Friday and Saturday. Him and his good wife Sharon are here. Looking forward to another lesson this morning. Brother, come speak to us.
The passage that was just read are some words that Jesus uttered just soon before he was crucified. Most of us are aware of the fact that the name Jerusalem means city of peace. At least that is sort of the popular view. I'm not disputing it at all. But if you know anything about the history of the world, probably this town has had less peace than any other city on the face of the earth. It is the focal point of conflict between numerous religions, numerous ethnic groups, numerous ideologies, military control, and so forth, and has constantly been sort of in the crosshairs of human hatred and anger. Jesus, of course, comes into the world to be not only the Savior for the Hebrew people, but also ultimately to be the Savior of all mankind. But it was necessary that he be sacrificed as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And as he is there in this discussion with his disciples, and they've asked about the city of Jerusalem, Jesus warns them of the impending doom of the city and how he had been rejected. He knows what's going to unfold. He knows how this is going to end. And not only does he know that his own life is going to come to an end in this ironically named city of peace, also the city itself would be the object of intense destruction at the hands of the Romans. The lesson this morning is going to be a little unusual, a little on the macabre side, because I'm going to deal a lot with some things that we probably don't talk about much. But there's a reason for the discussion. But I want us to begin with a survey of some of the history, beginning with the city and its capture by David. We're looking at a model of the city of Jerusalem, the city of David as it becomes known when David captures it, narrated in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And it's quite a small town. It's about 7 to 10 acres in area, much, much smaller than people normally think in terms of. And the part of the city where it's situated in relationship to that map is this spur that extends southward from where the temple location will eventually be built. The temple is up on the northern end, and Solomon, of course, is going to build the structure there. David does a lot of advanced preparation for it. And finally, it's constructed. And to a large extent, the city of Jerusalem is confined within that area, that sort of amoeba-looking shaped section. The expansion to the west, if you were with us yesterday, we talked about the exodus down from the north and a lot of refugees coming from the destruction of the country of Israel at the hands of the Assyrians. But for our purposes this morning, we're going to be basically concentrating on the city in its development through time. When David is going to capture this, the city water system is going to be the vulnerable point. And he lays down a challenge. He throws down the gauntlet, basically telling his military, whoever gets up the water shaft will be the commander-in-chief of the army. Of course, in this situation, or the commander of the army, of course, in this situation, Joab already has that role, and I'm almost of the suspicion that David's trying to figure out how to maneuver Joab out, but at the same time it ends up sort of backfiring on him because Joab is the one who takes up the challenge. And Joab is the one who goes through the water supply in order to access the interior of the city. This is the entrance of that system, dating from the time before David. You can visit this today. It is a very narrow passage. It's up within the interior of the city with that corbelled roof that is there. And all of this is original, dating from, we're not exactly sure the date, but it precedes 1050 BC, at the time when David would be coming on the scene or so. And it's through this system that Joab is going to go in order to get to the interior of the town and open the gates. As you go down the flight of steps, you can faintly see a guardrail, handrail down on the interior of that. You go down this fairly steep slope, and you finally come to a horizontal tunnel, and you're all, of course, underground here. And you can imagine it being dark. There are some places along the way that have indentations carved into the side of the wall where oil lamps would have rested in order to give a little bit of a flicker of light as you're making your way eventually to the water in order to supply your family and the needs of your household. A cross-section of this sort of shows how this works. The spring is located outside the city. Here's where the old city wall would have been situated, and this is the entrance inside the city in order to get into that tunnel. You go down that steep flight and a horizontal tunnel that goes out here and eventually extends beyond the city wall. The city wall, again, would be about right there, and there's a pool that has been dug down, a big shaft, and the water from the spring is going to go into the pool. And you come out here, lower your jar down, fill it up, and come back into the safety of the city through this tunnel. And it's through this system that Joab manages to get into the security of the waterworks, and probably in sort of a Trojan horse kind of maneuver goes in, because the occupants, the Jebusites in Jerusalem, are very self-confident. And they challenge David with a bit of trash talk, saying, even the lame and the blind will be able to defend our city against you. And that's probably not the thing to say to David, because David is going to react very strongly to that, and Joab in particular does. And I picture them sort of relaxing their guard around the water system, and Joab goes in and probably opens the city gate from the inside and lets the army in, and David captures the city. And this is going to become the capital. It's named Jerusalem before this. We have some references to the city in other ancient secular literature, so we know it's legitimately named. And David, of course, now is going to make the city of peace his capital. However, things don't always go absolutely smoothly in the process. Now, this is a view northward, south of that city of David. This spur right here is where the ancient city of David was. The temple would have been situated there on that golden dome area that is now occupied by the Dome of the Rock. And this is one of the points of dispute and argumentation in the modern political scene as the Israelis and Palestinians are trying to sort of resolve their issues, which I doubt they'll ever get resolved, but that's another modern politic world. Now, as we look at this, the Kidron Valley is this valley that comes across on the eastern side. The New Testament will refer a few times to Jesus crossing from the temple area up here, going through the Kidron Valley on top of Mount of Olivet to the other side to Bethany. And so that's sort of the framework of those geographic references. Now, as we look at this, again, the city of David is situated basically on that spur. I want us to look at some unusual features on the other side, though. On the other side, across from the city of David, are a series of rock-hewn tombs. Tombs in the ancient world were typically outside of the city limit. Actually, that sort of characterizes most of the cemeteries in our modern world as well. Most of the time, cemeteries are outside of the city limit. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You can probably name all kinds of cemeteries that are within city limits. But what has happened is the city has grown up around them. Almost always, the cemetery starts out outside of the city. But then as the city grows, it sort of begins to envelop all of this within the framework of the city limits. So one of the things that we can often do in our archaeological pursuit is find out where is the cemetery, and that gives us sort of a sense of the boundary, maximum size of the city at a given point in time. Well, that's exactly what's happened here. People normally don't want the burial remains of their loved ones that close by, but yet they want them close by enough that they can go and visit the tomb. And so in this situation, there are a series of rock-hewn tombs along that Kidron Valley. One of those in particular is really interesting. And we're going to look at a series of tombs this morning. I realize that's probably not what you expected in a discussion of Jerusalem. But we're going to come back and tie an element into this. This is one of those tombs, and it is the tomb of the royal steward, depending on the Bible translation that you use. Now, I have up here transliterated the Asher al-Habayat. If you read Hebrew, well, don't worry about it. It is written properly in Hebrew, but the Asher al-Habayat. Now, literally, this means who is over the house. That's literally what the phrase means. Asher al-Habayat is who is over the house. That actually is the title of an office in the ancient world. It is not simply a description of a location or a description of someone's role within the city, within the household. This is an official title, and the person would be known as the Asher al-Habayat, the who is over the house. Now, most of your Bibles will translate this to royal steward or something like that to identify it's an office. All right, that's okay. But this tomb is a tomb that someone who was an Asher al-Habayat dug in order for himself to be buried in. Now, as you look at this, you see a doorway. Don't advance it. Go back. Here is a doorway that goes into the tomb. There's actually a window here, and then there's an indentation that you see in the photograph. Originally, that indentation had an inscription there, and the inscription is removed and is now in the British Museum in London. And you can see it if you have to sort of search for it, but you can find it. Now, the next picture is going to show a drawing of this. There's the top plan of the tomb. It's not terribly large. It would be about the size maybe of your fellowship hall up here. But yet, most of us would think in terms, that's more than of a tomb than most of us would need, but this is a family tomb. This is a tomb where multiple members would be interred over a period of time. Here is a drawing of the front of it, looking at it directly on. There's the door that corresponds with the photograph, and there is the window, and that lintel area is where the inscription was. Now, the inscription in and of itself is rather interesting, but sadly it is broken at a certain point. Now, it's really horrifying how many inscriptions from the ancient world have breaks at very critical points. It's often there are breaks when it would identify a specific name of an individual, and so we're sort of left wondering what all is going on here. But I've sort of set the scene, and I want you to pick up the dynamic of what's happening here. And the inscription looks like this. You can see the broken area there where part of it is abraded. It begins over here on the right-hand side, goes through the break, and continues on with a wraparound kind of approach. The translation is as follows. This is the tomb of Shebna Yahu, who is over the house. That's our phrase. That's exactly our phrase, the Asher al-Habayat. Now, the part that is under question is this part, the tomb of Shebna, and then it breaks off. That's the part that is missing right through there. But we'll come back to this. But this is the tomb of Shebna Yahu. This is the postulate reconstruction. Who is over the house. There is no silver or gold here, but his bones with the bones of his Amah with him. Now, an Amah basically is a concubine. All right? Cursed be the man who will open this. Now, what they're concerned about is somebody coming along, breaking in the tomb, expecting there to be gold, silver, or whatever, and stealing the goods. Sort of the pyramid kind of an Egyptian tomb kind of thing. Most of those tombs are found absolutely empty because people realize there's wealth there and they're going to break in. And here the attempt is curse be anybody who breaks into the tomb and disturbs our peace. All right? Now, as this unfolds, the question is, who is this? Now, there's a reference, and if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn with me to Isaiah chapter 22. And in this passage, Isaiah is talking, and he's upbraiding a fellow by the name of Shebna. A fellow by the name of Shebna. Now, the Bible tends oftentimes somewhat to contract the names of the individuals. In a lot of inscriptions, there are a lot of these ancient names where they would end in Yahu kind of thing, which is a form of the name Yahweh. And so in this case, it's Shebna Yahu, Shebna, servant of the Lord kind of thing. But listen to this description. Thus says the Lord God of hosts. This is beginning in verse 15. Go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household. ESV renders it, who is over the household. Now that's exactly our same Hebrew phrase, the Asher al-Habayah. So come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household, and say to him, what have you to do here? And whom have you here that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself? You who cut out a tomb on the height and carve a dwelling for yourself in the rock. Now notice all of the description dovetails so well with what is here. Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, O you strong man. He will seize firm hold on you and whirl you around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. And there you shall die, and then there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house. Now we don't know what it is that Shebna did that God was so angry about. But Shebna was one of those servants who was over the house, connected with Hezekiah. Now, last night when we were talking, Shebna was in that group to whom the Rabshakeh spoke. And they asked the Rabshakeh, don't talk to us in Hebrew, speak to us in Aramaic, for we understand it. But he's going to get on the outs with the Lord for some reason. Now, you may wonder, why would anybody suggest that this tomb is associated with Shebna? Well, one, there are not a whole lot of who are over the houses people. Okay, so that's a limited title that throws out into the turf, all right? So that is a specific title of an individual who would serve in that capacity one at a time, all right? Secondly, the style of the handwriting, the inscription, is time of Isaiah. And this is fairly secure by even scholars that don't believe the Bible. Thirdly, it is in rock, as is indicated within the narrative here. All of the evidence points to the identification of this tomb as being associated with Shebna, who is mentioned in the Bible. Now, if you're thinking critically and analytically here, probably one of the questions that comes to mind is, all right, well, what about the Bible's statement here that you're not going to die here, and yet this statement that indicates that he's buried here? Well, this is not near the problem that one might make it out to be. In the ancient world, most people are buried the same day they die. That's a tradition. That's the way it still generally functions. So one who is well-to-do will make plans for the tomb well ahead of time. If you're going to carve out a tomb out of rock, you'd better have it prepared before you actually pass away, because nobody's going to have enough time to do it all in one day. And I'm of the inclination to think that his Amah, his concubine, preceded him in death, and she is interred here, and the inscription is written in such a way in anticipation of his own death, not realizing what God is going to say through Isaiah. Now, the ultimate demise of Shebna we don't know about, but I would argue the Bible is true in what happens. He's probably taken off into exile, probably by the Assyrians in some fashion, but we don't know for sure. Now, the last part of this, cursed be the man who will open this. The tomb is now someone's home. I'm not real gung-ho about the idea of living in a tomb, but apparently there's some people have no qualms about it. But it's probably not the kind of thing that most of us would think in terms of a comfortable setting. Now, admittedly, we're, 2,700 years removed from this event. I would trust that all of the accompanying issues would have dissipated. Let's just sort of leave it at that. All right, moving on to another discussion, another tomb. Now, this one is more elaborate than the last one. This one has multi-chambers that are involved. And as you walk into this modern chapel, you'll go into this sort of receiving room. Now, this room measures about 20 feet by about 24 feet in length. Pretty good sized room. Radiating off of it are various rooms in different directions. And this was a much more extended tomb associated with the ancient world. And an extended family would be buried here. Several generations, perhaps a large family kind of situation. Now, as you look at this, you can perhaps faintly see, you walk in here, and there's sort of a hatched area here on the top side of this, and what look like some drawings around here. Well, those are benches. So you walk in from here, you go in here, same level, and then there are these benches that are just about the height of a table like this. So if we walk in from one end into the room, we would walk in and there would be a bench here, a bench there, and a bench here. And these are designed to accommodate various individuals who would be placed then, when they pass away, on the bench. Now, another feature of this are some, you might notice over here this sort of semicircular element. This looks sort of like a horseshoe. Well, that is a raised section of the stone where the head of the deceased would be placed and cradled to keep remember, the person is usually interred the same day he or she passes away, so they would be left there in order to keep the head from sort of falling to one side to the other, so they're looking straight up. Now, if we count the number of horseshoe headrests, all right, and then if there isn't one on it, let's assume there's one person who will be put on the shelf, all right? You with me? All right, so we're going to count how many this might accommodate. So there's no horseshoe on that, so there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's a fragment of one there, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 people. A lot of people interred here. What happens with number 22 or number 23? What are you going to do? Where are you going to put them? Well, there's a design for this, all right? And this comes back to the hatched gray areas. And if you'll notice, they tend to stop right at the edge of the bench. Those are actually caves. So that if you walk in, here would be the bench, and beneath one of them would be a cave carved out that's fairly large. And what they would do is, after a period of time, they would gather up the bones of the deceased and dump them into the cave. Literally dump them into the cave. Now, to you and me, this is really disrespectful. But to people in the ancient world, it's not at all disrespectful. This is where you want to be buried. Not so much the cave per se, but you want to be, remember this phrase out of the Old Testament? Gathered to one's fathers. This is a big family reunion kind of scene in the afterlife. And they look forward to this. Now, my mother passed away about 4 years ago, and my dad passed away a year ago next month. And one of the things that each of them asked was, take us back and bury us in the old family burial plot back home. Okay, so we made plans at appropriate time to take their remains back and bury them in the old family burial plot. This is their form of the old family burial plot. And it was extremely important. Now, if you remember the cave of Machpelah in Genesis, whenever Sarah dies, Abraham buys this cave, sort of like this. He buys this cave, and he buries Sarah there. He eventually is buried in the same cave. And then Isaac and Rebekah are buried in the cave. And then eventually Leah and Jacob are buried in the cave. Rachel is buried somewhere else. Now, as to how many other people are going to be buried in that cave, we don't know. But we know at least 6 individuals, according to the biblical text, were buried in that single cave of Machpelah. Now, that one is arranged a little differently than this, but it was, again, similar kind of thing, being buried in a cave with one's ancestors. All right. The next photograph is really weird, all right? I visited the cave and was looking into one of these, I visited the tomb, looking into one of these caves, and this is what greeted me. I just had the flash, and it didn't know what I was taking a picture of, just taking a picture, and here are all these bones inside of this. And if you look at this, a lot of long bones, but there are some skull fragments and so forth. Now again, to us this is rather macabre. This is bizarre. But to the people of antiquity, this was their resting place. I had a privilege a few years ago to excavate at a site, a tomb site, in the Valley of Hinnom, which is sort of the template of Gehenna. I'll not pursue that discussion, but Valley of Hinnom is on the west side of Jerusalem. And this is a cutaway drawing of the cave, of the tomb. And in this situation, you have the central courtyard area. There's a little doorway that goes into the central chamber, and then there are these benches that surround it with these little headrests. Again, the same kind of thing. Now here's a picture of what it actually looks like now, because they've quarried the rock away and the top part's totally missing. And so if you look at this, you can see the arrangement. This photograph is from the same angle basically as the drawing. I hope you can sort of transpose the two and see the connection. Now in order to show, again, a little bizarre, in order to show a little bit of what this would look like, here are a number of us positioning ourselves in the receptacles. That, by the way, is me on the back end over there. And now, as you rotate around, there is the cave opening. This is the same tomb, but there's the cave opening into which the bones were dumped. Now, there's an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Gavriel Barkai who excavated the site. And this was fully intact. Jeremiah had talked about these tombs in the book of Jeremiah, and he talked about them typically being emptied and the bones being scattered on the surface of the ground in a contemptuous way by the Babylonians. Somehow this tomb escaped that treatment. It's basically the only one that did. And in the excavation of the material, there were some fascinating finds that came to light, among which were two of these little tiny artifacts. And when I say really tiny, the length of that thing is about 3/4 of an inch. They found it through the sifting process, but they recognized this is not a pebble, this is not a broken piece of pottery, this is something very different. The color's odd, the shape is odd, and as they scrutinized it, they came to the realization this is a piece of metal rolled up. Now, I don't know if you all did this, probably all of you did at some point in time, when you get your stick of chewing gum and you would roll it up lengthwise, right? Any of you ever do that? That's the way this was treated. I affectionately refer to it as the chewing gum inscription, all right? And when you unroll it, it actually has a very fascinating inscription on it. These are on display in the Israel Museum, and the inscription reads, in part, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Now, most people think that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest preserved copies of the Bible. They're not. This is. This comes from the time of Josiah. And certainly it reflects an attitude of respect to God. It's open to question exactly what the people were thinking, but I'm inclined to think not only does it show a respect for God in this life, but also a respect for God in the life to come. May the Lord continue to bless you and keep you. And may the Lord continue to make his face to shine upon you. Now that's open to question. That's another whole discussion. But it's in one of these tombs where this kind of thing was discovered. Now we're going to shift gears into the New Testament era. This is a view of the western wall of Jerusalem. This is a big retaining wall that characterized that was necessary in order to hold the soil in place upon which then the temple was built. And as we look at this, the temple would have, go back please, the temple would have been situated where that big dome is situated now. This is the western wall, and this is now the most holy of the synagogues of the Hebrew people, of the Israelis. And so they'll come here, and actually this is their synagogue. It's an outdoor synagogue. And you can go there, and you can get right up to the wall, you can touch the wall, and the wall is built by Herod the Great. This has nothing directly to do with the temple. This is not a violation of the statement that Jesus makes of not one stone will be left upon another, because this is not the temple structure. This is just a retaining wall. It would be like the wall that separates you from Walmart down here. Tear the building down, not that I'm suggesting anybody do that. Tear the building down, the retaining wall stays there, and so that's sort of what this is all about. This is the kind of scene that Jesus and the apostles would have been familiar with in their activities there and in their preaching. But again, in 1967, when the Israelis take control of the old city of Jerusalem, they feverishly excavate all over the place, and they expose these steps down on the southern part of the section of the retaining wall, the platform of Herod the Great. This is a model of the city of Jerusalem, and these steps are shown very clearly here in this model, and two gateway openings that would allow access to the interior of the temple area. The steps here are from the time of Herod the Great. Now, most of these have been reconstructed, but you can see the ragged sections down here. Those are the original steps as they now still stand. And here's a picture of the steps and the relationship and the ruins there of the offices. And here's a picture of my wife standing upon those raw steps of Herod. Now, one of the things that's really exciting is to stand here and realize, I wonder if Jesus ever walked up these steps. Now, I can't say for sure that he did. I know he went to the temple. There's no question about that. But whether he walked up these steps to go to the temple or not, I don't know. I'm not going to ask, but I have a hunch that there are several entrances to this church building. I know there are at least two, and apparently there's one on this side, and there are probably two or three others. And the way people tend to be, we get our traditional way that we go in and out, and we hardly ever darken one of the other. Okay, maybe Jesus did the same kind of thing. I don't know. But he's certainly aware of these steps. And to be aware of the fact that you are in a location that in some weird way intersects with the life of Jesus is a rather exhilarating experience. We continue. This is that model that I was alluding to. And this is a huge model. It covers much larger area than your church building. It would intrude out into the parking lot significantly. If you ever go to Israel today, I highly recommend that you go to the model. Ideally, you should go to the model before you see anything else in Jerusalem. Go see whatever it is you're going to see in Jerusalem, and then come back to the model and look at it again. And it'll sort of embed everything in place. But most people don't have enough time or resources to do both of those trips, but on the same journey. But this is a view of the temple area. Looking from the east toward the west, this is the front of the temple. This is the court of the Gentiles. This is Solomon's porch, which is referred to several times in the book of Acts, where the disciples gather. Now, the court of the Gentiles is on the south side as well as the north side. Why is it called the court of the Gentiles? Because it's okay for Gentiles to be there, all right? This is the area where Jesus would have driven out from that location the money changers for their abuse of the temple precinct. And when the Bible, many times, there are two words that appear in the New Testament for temple. One of them has to do with the larger scope of the property, and the other one has to do with the holy place itself. Rarely does the word holy place itself appear. Most of the time it's the temple precinct. It would be sort of like including your parking lot and the whole area, okay? This would be referred to as the temple kind of thing. And so the court of the Gentiles comes into this. And Jesus, of course, is indicting them for the abuse of the property and the purpose for which all of this is intended. But there's another element that comes into the picture. As we look at this a little closer up, there's an episode in the life of Paul that becomes very dramatic in all of this. And what is fascinating is the biblical text says nothing specifically about what I'm going to point out, but it is very powerfully implied. And it has to do with this wall right there. Now, current events is remarkable. The wall. Now, it seems like everybody's talking about a wall of some kind. Well, this wall is a big deal. And this comes into the narrative in Acts chapter 21. When Paul returns from one of his missionary journeys, actually his last missionary journey, and he comes to Jerusalem and he's talking with the apostles, and the report is giving that people are saying that you're going around telling everybody that they should totally abandon everything associated with Judaism and the Mosaic Law, and here are these fellows that are here and they're ending their vow. Go with them, purify yourself, pay their fees for the ending of their vow so that everybody will know that you're actually okay. So Paul goes to the temple. He follows their advice. He goes to the temple, and he's accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple. Remember this? Well, wait a minute. Gentiles will be okay here. They'd be okay over there. That's why it's called the court of the Gentiles. It's okay to bring them there. Paul is actually accused of breaching that wall and bringing them within the confines of that wall, perhaps into here, but at least past that wall. And while there's not a specific reference to that in the biblical text, that's what the whole narrative is alluding to. Now, in that wall, there were a series of signs that were scattered every so often, about every 15 cubits or so. And this is one of them. There are only 2 of these that have been found in excavation. One of them is in Istanbul. Half of one is in the Israel Museum. Those are the only 2 that have ever been found. And they're written alternating in Greek and in Latin. And of course, those would be the languages that would be of concern, because Jewish people would be able to go in here. But those who are not Jewish would be typically people who would read Latin and Greek, and therefore they would be able to read this. At least that's the assumption. Now, the translation of the inscription is really interesting because it sounds like a lawyer. I don't know if there are any lawyers in the audience. I hope you don't take that the wrong way. But this will sound like a lawyer, and I'm sure that you would agree in the way this sounds. And it translates as, "No alien may enter within the barrier and wall around the temple. Whoever is caught is alone responsible for the death which follows." That's the lawyer-sounding part. You know, it's not going to say who's going to do this or at all, but somebody's going to die, but we're not at fault for it, so watch out. And that's exactly why that riot begins. Paul is accused of breaching that wall with his Gentile friends, which he wasn't an idiot. He knew that it would be inappropriate to do that. This was just a charge leveled against him, and it becomes the volatility. Paul then is rescued from the mob. They take him to the Antonia fortress, and they allow him, at his request, to give a defense. This is when he begins to defend himself in Acts chapter 22, and he talks about his conversion. And when he gets to the point of the fact that the gospel is now for the Gentiles, everything erupts again. Everybody starts going nuts, and Paul is ushered into the Antonia fortress, where there then is discovered by his nephew a plot to kill him. And the nephew then reports it at Paul's encouragement to the commandant of the fortress. And Paul is then ushered off to Caesarea Maritima, where he remains several years before he has to appeal to Caesar to go to Rome. All of that because of that wall. And yet, if you read the text, there's no specific reference to it. But it brings all of this into high relief as the story unfolds. Paul, of course, this is a picture of the model and the Antonia fortress into which Paul is taken. Many have suggested this is also where Jesus was tried before Pilate, which is a possibility. I'm going to accept that at least as a possibility. We don't know exactly where the hearing before Pilate took place, because the Bible simply talks in terms of it being the pavement, but there are several options of how to understand that. But the Antonia fortress is one location possible. An alternative is to consider Herod's palace. Now, we're looking at this differently, from a different angle. The Antonia fortress over here is on the right-hand side, upper right corner of the photograph. This is Herod's palace, which, by the way, Herod's not around to be living in it. Therefore, it's vacant. You know, there's vacancy sign out front. And if you're a decadent Roman, don't want to be in Palestine, wish you were somewhere else, you don't want to be here trying to oversee these rebellious people and so forth, I'm sure that you would much rather be in a palace that has fountains and baths and gardens and every luxury that you can imagine. And I'm of the inclination to think this is where Jesus had his hearing before Pilate. Jesus, of course, is going to be taken off and crucified. This is the new traditional Golgotha. Most of you have seen pictures of this. If you use your imagination, you can sort of see an image of a skull here. But the problem with this is that this skullish-looking image comes into existence in medieval times. It is not original to antiquity. Nearby, there is a nifty example of a garden, hence the garden tomb. This is literally, I could even probably throw a stone from the traditional Golgotha, new traditional, to this. And it's easy to think in terms of this being the location where Jesus was buried. But again, the probability is pretty slim, because this actually is a tomb that dates from the divided monarchy period on the basis of its style and design, back to the similar kind of tomb that we looked at a moment ago. More likely, Jesus actually is crucified and buried at the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for most of us is a bit of a downer, Because as you go in, you're suddenly accosted by all kinds of highly ritualized things. Now, some people are okay with this, and it doesn't bother a lot of folks, and I'm not sitting in judgment on how you react to this, but for me, this says nothing. This gives me no perception whatsoever. The other two examples, at least, are sort of characteristic, but this one is not. Now, some may wonder, how in the world would Jesus be crucified and buried within a Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Well, in actuality, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over an acre in area. So it wouldn't necessarily be far removed. It would be sort of like one end of this building as opposed to the other end of the building. And these areas are quite small. What is critically important, however, is the fact that he is raised from the dead. Now, this is a drawing of a typical tomb of the 1st century A.D. A lot of similarities here. And in this scenario, you'll have the portrayal of the opening into the interior of the cave with a rolling stone. Of course, you recall the story in the Bible where the ladies are concerned about who's going to roll the stone away. Matter of fact, there's a great book by that title, Who Moved the Stone, by Frank Morrison. I highly recommend that you read it. It's a defense of the resurrection in and of itself. But here is the portrayal of that rolling stone scotched in place in order to keep it open. Again, in this situation, the deceased would be laid out, wrapped in the garments, and left there on the bench to deteriorate. Now, over a period of time, what's going to happen is they're going to gather those bones up and put them not in a cave in this situation. They're going to put them in another kind of receptacle. Now, here is a drawing of one that was actually discovered about 1992 or so by the Israeli Waterworks as a backhoe broke into it. And this is a drawing of it, looking at it from the top. Here's the entrance, and there are these radiating chambers that go off to the sides. You'll notice a rectangle, 2 rectangles in this one. There are actually several of these that were situated in this tomb, and among them were a number of these stone boxes. These are known as ossuaries. They measure about this long, and about this high, and about this wide. And the bones of the deceased would be gathered up and put inside these boxes. And you could have several individuals in a single box. And then the boxes would be pushed back into those little radiating chambers and left there until who knows when. When Jesus died, this is what basically they expected to happen. Now, Jesus is put in a tomb where no one else has been placed. That is extremely important in the storyline because it basically eliminates confusion of whose remains are whose. If nobody was in the tomb and now there's only one body in the tomb and that one body that was in the tomb is gone, what happened? So this is extremely important. The ladies are coming on that first day of the week in order to pay their homage. And part of the purposes of the spices and so forth, you can imagine, I won't pursue that. But they're also showing their honor and respect. And over a period of time, they would think in terms of Jesus' bones would be put in a box similar to this and buried along with Joseph of Arimathea and the rest of the family. He basically was adopted within that burial context. This ossuary, though, is quite interesting. On the end of it, it has an inscription that says, Joseph, the son of Caiaphas. Wow. This is certainly a tomb of somebody of some wealth. The fact that it's decorated as it is demonstrates, go back please. The fact that it's decorated so highly also implies somebody of some wealth and influence. Most of these ossuaries have no inscriptions on them whatsoever. No design on them. But this one obviously is very, very ornate. But on the end of it, you have Joseph, the son of Caiaphas. Now, I don't know of any scholar, whether believer or not, who denies that this is associated with the Caiaphas of the New Testament. There are not many Caiaphases. There's certainly not many Caiaphases of wealth. And there's certainly not many Caiaphases of wealth during the time frame of the 1st century A.D., which is exactly the time frame of this. In this ossuary, there were discovered the remains of 6 individuals. There was 2 infants, a toddler, a teen, an adult female, a man about 60 years of age. Very probably the one about 60 is the Joseph. But beyond that, we don't know. The Bible tells us that the Romans were notorious for crucifying folks. This is the only piece of evidence of a crucifixion ever found. Material evidence. The only piece. Out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of crucifixions that people endured at the hands of the Romans, this is the only piece of evidence. It comes from Jerusalem. It comes out of an ossuary, not this one we were just looking at, but it comes out of an ossuary on the north side of Jerusalem. Probably looking at that, unless you're a bone specialist, you don't know what you're looking at. I have a full-size reproduction of the artifact itself, right here. I suspect unless you're a specialist with bone construction, and I pass it around, you still wouldn't be able to figure out what this is. I have a nail from the first century world. This artifact has a nail that's left in it, and the end of it is bent. You can see the bent end. They think that it hit a knot in the tree. Here's a nail from the first century A.D. Just slightly longer than the one that is on here. But let me show you what part this is. This is actually a part of the foot. And here is a foot model. And in this situation, the nail would have been driven through the heel, right there. So that the feet of the individual apparently were straddling the post in this fashion. Now, I've talked with specialists, bone specialists, and they tell me that this would be an absolutely ideal situation to attach someone to a cross where they, one, could not get down, and secondly, sustain their weight and leave them on the cross. The Bible does not tell us specifically how Jesus is attached to the cross. I'm aware of the fact that many of you are probably already ahead of me and thinking, well, the Bible says that not one bone of his body will be broken. I'm certainly okay with that. But talking with the bone specialist, they tell me there's a sense in which a nail driven through the heel would not really be constituted as breaking. It's a piercing, yes. But this does not shatter. Usually what is thought to be understood in the breaking of the bone not occurring is when the Romans would come along and the person's still alive, and they would take an iron bar and smash the shins and the thighs so that the person would have no ability to rise up. What I would like you to do next Lord's Day, and even sort of in a sense for today, when you get to the point in your worship assembly and we are gathered around the table, think about this. Think about this as something that Jesus voluntarily did. He knew what was going to happen. And he knew that he was going to endure this agony for you and me. Why? Because he wanted us to enjoy peace. Ironically, the city of peace, which basically knows no peace and shows no peace in regards to killing the Prince of Peace, brings the potential of peace to you and to me because of the sacrifice on the cross in the city of Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. How often I would have gathered you together as a hen gathers her brood under my wings, but you would not. That same invitation is extended to us in our world today, where Jesus invites us to come to enjoy the peace under his care with the redemption that he offered through the sacrifice on the cross. And how many people will not listen? Will you? Will you take the opportunity to obey the gospel message of Jesus Christ, to appropriate into your life His death, burial, and resurrection through your baptism into Jesus and your own reenaction of death, burial, and resurrection in the process of baptism, raised like He was to a new life with a new hope, where you and I can enjoy the peace everlasting in the city of peace that will come down from the Father. Won't you come while we stand and sing?